The sun beat down on the dusty Texas plains like a hammer on an anvil. The wind swept hot and dry, carrying the scent of sagebrush and burnt leather across the endless horizon. Jedediah Jed Harlan squinted through the haze, gripping the reins of his horse with hands calloused and steady. His face was weathered, half hidden beneath the brim of his battered hat, but his eyes cold hard, and haunted never lost focus. The small posse rode in tight formation, 6 men hardened by war and wilderness. They'd been tracking the Comanche scouts for days, stalking the edges of their territory with the ruthless patience of predators. Jed's jaw tightened when the distant flicker of movement caught his eye. It was a small group, barely more than shadows among the Mesquite 3 warriors and a girl. The order came from Lieutenant Marcus Dale, a man Jed respected only enough to fear. "Surround 'em," Dale barked, voice sharp as a pistol shot. "No prisoners. Kill the men. Take the girl." Jed's heart sank at the last part, but he said nothing. His life had been reduced to obedience, carrying out commands he barely understood anymore. The men fanned out, guns drawn, and within moments the Comanche warriors were dead arrows and bullets piercing the dusty silence. The girl, barely older than a child, stood trembling where she'd been hiding behind a rock. Jed dismounted and approached slowly, her dark eyes locked onto his, wide with terror but fierce, like a cornered panther. Her hair was tangled and dust-streaked, her clothes torn, but she held herself with a quiet dignity that unsettled him. "Please," she whispered, voice cracked and trembling. "Please, don't take off my clothes." Jed swallowed hard. He'd seen too much death and cruelty to be moved by a plea. But something about her, the way she looked at him like he was the last man standing between her and hell, cut deeper than any bullet. Lieutenant Dale's shadow fell over Jed's shoulder. "Orders are orders, Harlan. Break her spirit if you have to. That's what they want, fear and submission. You're the one to do it." Jed's hand hovered near his gun, but instead of violence, a strange numbness spread through him. The girl clung to her torn blanket, trembling. And he saw something else in her eyes, pain, yes, but also a fierce will not yet broken. He knelt beside her, voice low and rough. "I ain't gonna hurt you more than I have to." She looked at him like she wanted to believe him. Then, in the cold light of that merciless night, he did what he was told. The act was mechanical, brutal, and it shattered a part of him that no bullet ever had. When it was over, the girl's sobs were quiet but raw, and Jed felt the weight of what he'd done like a stone in his chest. That night, by the fire, Jed sat apart from the others, staring into the flames. The men laughed and boasted, but their voices were distant echoes. His mind kept returning to the girl's pletha, fragile humanity in those few words. He didn't sleep. Jed's past was a tangle of blood and dust. A Confederate scout turned mercenary, he'd fought in battles that killed more than both. The war had taken everything: his family, his faith, his future. He'd buried that man deep under years of whiskey and gunfire. But something in the girl's eyes peeled back those layers, forcing him to confront the man he'd become. "Jed," Dale called the next morning, shaking him from his thoughts. "We're moving out. Keep her close. Don't let her out of your sight." Jed nodded, but inside, a storm raged. The girl Wea, as he later learned, was more than a prisoner. She was a living testament to the violence and broken promises of this land. And in that moment, Jed realized he might be the only one who could change what came next. The trail ahead was long and unforgiving. The dust would rise again, the guns would roar, and the ghosts of the past would hunt them all. But Jed was caught in a new kind of war, one between the man he was and the man he might still be. And somewhere deep down, the girl's whispered plea echoed like a prayer, haunting the silence between the rattling hooves and the endless sky. "Would you like me to continue with part 2, the ride west next?" "You said yes," ChatGPT said. "Awesome. Here's part 2, the ride west, the next 700 words." Continuing Jed and Wea's journey through the dusty, dangerous frontier. Part 2, the ride west. The sun crept low over the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of burnt orange and bruised purple. The heat of the day gave way to a cool that hinted at the coming night, but the open plains didn't offer much comfort. Jed's horse trudged steadily beneath him, hooves kicking up small clouds of dust as the small posse pressed onward toward the next outpost. Wea rode quietly between the men, her dark eyes fixed somewhere beyond the present, always distant, always wary. She hadn't spoken since the night Jed followed the orders that broke something inside him. But Jed felt her presence like a weight in the saddle beside him, constant and uneasy. He kept his eyes forward, but his mind roiled beneath his calm exterior. The words she'd begged him whispered in his ears, twisting in his gut. "Please, don't take off my clothes." Jed wasn't a man prone to second-guessing himself. The frontier left no room for softness. but Wea's plea clawed at something buried deep, something he'd thought dead with the war and the bodies he'd left behind. The posse rode through brush and broken scrub, the silence between the men thick with tension. Lieutenant Marcus Dale led the way, his jaw tight, eyes scanning for danger. He was a man shaped by fire and cruelty, his ambition as sharp as the Colt he carried at his hip. "You reckon she break?" one of the younger men asked, breaking the quiet. Dale grunted. "She break? They all do. It's only a matter of time." Jed didn't answer. His fingers tightened on the reins, knuckles white. He didn't know if he believed that anymore. That night, camp was made beneath a canopy of stars that seemed colder than the earth itself. The men set up their tents, building a fire that sputtered and hissed as the wind tugged at its flames. Jed sat apart from the others, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. Wea huddled near the fire, wrapped in the blanket Jed had given her. Her eyes caught the flickering light, reflecting something fierce and broken. For all her silence, Jed could tell she was watching him as closely as he watched her. Memories came unbidden, his wife's laughter before the war took her, his children's faces blurred by time and sorrow. The blood-soaked fields where he learned that mercy was a luxury few could afford. He wondered what ghosts haunted her dreams. "Jed," a voice called softly. It was one of the men, the youngest of the group, named Sam. "Why you so quiet? You ain't like the rest of us." Jed looked up, meeting Sam's curious gaze. "Maybe I ain't." Sam shrugged, settling closer to the fire. "We're out here doing what we gotta do. The world's a hard place. You learn to live with it, or you don't live long." Jed nodded slowly. "Sometimes, I think livin' with it means gettin' broken in pieces." Sam's face darkened. "Then what's the point?" Jed didn't have an answer. The night deepened, and Jed's thoughts turned restless. He slipped away from camp, moving quietly toward the ridge overlooking the flatlands. Below, the moonlight shimmered on the dry riverbed, silver and cold. He lit a cigarette, inhaling the sharp taste of tobacco and ash. The wind carried the faint cries of coyotes and the rustle of dry leaves. Wea's plea echoed again. His hands trembled slightly as he flicked the spent cigarette into the dirt. Back at camp, the others slept, but Jed couldn't find rest. He stood alone, watching the stars wheel overhead, thinking about the girl he'd broken, the way she'd looked at him, not with hate, but something like despair. He'd been a soldier, a killer, a man who'd done things he couldn't unsee, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something else, regret, maybe, or the barest hint of mercy. Morning came harsh and unforgiving. The men broke camp and mounted up, the dust swirling like ghosts chasing them across the plain. Jed glanced at Wea once more. She met his gaze, holding it steady, and for a brief moment, the distance between them shrank, but the road ahead was long, and neither of them knew what lay waiting in the endless west. The dawn broke pale and cold over the ragged line of mesas and sagebrush. The posse moved out early, the men's faces grim as they pushed deeper into the western wilderness. Jed rode near the rear, glancing at Wea as she sat stiff-backed on her horse, her eyes sharp despite the exhaustion etched into her features. The sun climbed higher, baking the earth beneath them. When the moment came, Jed spotted movement ahead, a sudden flurry of dust rising near a thicket of mesquite. Wea's horse snorted, rearing nervously. Without warning, she spurred forward, breaking from the group. "Stop her!" one of the men shouted, drawing his gun, but Jed's heart hammered, and before he could think, he shouted, "Let her go." The posse froze, confusion rippling through their ranks. Jed's voice was low but firm. "She's not one of us. Let her run." Lieutenant Dale's eyes narrowed, a dangerous smile creeping across his weathered face. "Harlan, you've gone soft." Jed's jaw clenched. "I'm done with this. I'm done with all of it." The men hesitated, but Dale barked, "Find her, or you're all dead men." Jed didn't wait for orders. He spurred his horse after Wea, the dust swallowing their figures as they disappeared into the wild. For hours they rode, the sun burning unforgiving overhead, the air thick with silence and the scent of sage. Jed kept his distance, but Wea didn't glance back. It wasn't fear he saw in her eyes, it was something else. Defiance. Eventually, the horses slowed, and Wea pulled up near a rocky outcrop. She slid from her saddle, limping slightly. Jed caught up and dismounted, approaching cautiously. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She didn't answer at first, but then nodded, grimacing. "Thorn," she said softly, gesturing to a swollen ankle. Jed knelt, carefully pulling the thorn from her skin. Blood welled up, but Wea said nothing, only watched him with wary eyes. "Why did you run?" he asked quietly. She met his gaze. "Because I don't want to die." Jed swallowed hard, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He wanted to say something, apologize, but words felt empty. The desert around them was vast and merciless, but in that moment, the two of them were alone against the world. As night fell, Jed built a small fire from dry twigs, the flames flickering against the darkness. Weah sat close, wrapped in her blanket, silent but present. Jed couldn't help but steal glances at her. She was a mystery, a puzzle of strength and pain, and a living reminder of everything he was trying to outrun. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough. "I didn't want to hurt you." Weah's eyes glistened in the firelight. "You did," Jed nodded, knowing the truth. But he also knew something else. Something that scared him. He was no longer sure whose side he was on. "Would you like me to continue with part 4? Smoke and Ghosts?" "You said yes," ChatGPT said. "Here's part 4. Smoke and Ghosts." Continuing Jed and Weah's journey. 700 words, rich in atmosphere and tension. Part 4. Smoke and Ghosts. The morning sun cast long shadows over the burnt remains of a settlement. Jed and Weah approached cautiously, the acrid scent of charred wood and scorched earth hanging heavy in the air. The ruins spoke of violence. A savage hand had swept through this place not long ago, leaving only ash and silence. Weah slowed her horse, eyes narrowing as she scanned the desolation. Jed followed, every muscle taut with unease. "This used to be a homestead," Jed said quietly. "Folks lived here. Now there's nothing but ghosts." Weah's gaze drifted toward the blackened timbers. She pointed to a small, twisted piece of metal, lying half-buried in the dirt, a bullet casing. "They came quick," Jed murmured. "Maybe a raid." The two rode deeper into the remnants, stepping carefully over broken beams and shattered glass. Jed's thoughts swirled. This place was a grim reminder of the frontier's brutal truth. Violence never ended. It just changed forms. As they moved through the wreckage, Weah suddenly stopped, her hand raised in a silent signal. Jed followed her gaze and saw a faint set of footprints leading away from the ruins, pressed into the soft earth. "Someone left recently," Jed said. Weah nodded, her face unreadable. They decided to follow the tracks, hoping they would lead to safety or at least answers. The trail took them through dense scrub and rocky outcrops, the landscape shifting from burned earth to green grass dotted with wildflowers. The stark contrast unsettled Jed. Life and death existing side by side. At night, the desert whispered around their campfire. The flames flickered, casting dancing shadows that looked like ghosts in the dark. Weah sat close, her eyes reflecting the firelight as she hummed a soft, haunting melody, an ancient song, full of loss and hope. Jed listened, the sound stirring something deep inside him. He remembered the faces of the men he'd killed, the families he'd torn apart. For years, he'd carried their ghosts like a weight, numbing himself against the pain. But Weah's song was different. It was a bridge between worlds, between past and future, between destruction and survival. As the night deepened, Jed found himself opening up, telling her fragments of his story of war, loss, and the hollow ache of living with regret. She listened without judgment, her presence a balm to his shattered soul. But the danger was never far. Jed knew Dale and his men were hunting them, driven by bloodlust and duty twisted into obsession. He tightened his grip on his rifle, ready for the fight he hoped to avoid. In the stillness, the line between hunter and hunted blurred, and Jed wondered if redemption was just another ghost he was chasing in the smoke and dust. The frontier town of Dry Creek lay sprawled beneath a merciless sun, its wooden storefronts cracked and weathered by years of dust and wind. Saloon doors swung on creaking hinges, and the steady murmur of a town on edge hung thick in the air. Jed rode in slowly, Weah close behind, her dark eyes scanning the rough-hewn streets with a wary intelligence. The townsfolk watched from porches and alleyways, their gazes sharp and unwelcoming. Strangers were always trouble, but a Comanche girl was a threat. Jed felt the tension coil in his gut as he tethered his horse outside the general store. He knew better than to expect a warm welcome, but the hostility was harsher than usual. Men spat on the ground as he passed, and children were hurried inside with hurried warnings. Inside the saloon, the smell of whiskey and stale smoke wrapped around Jed like a second skin. The bartender eyed him with suspicion, but served him a shot without a word. Jed downed it, the burn of familiar comfort. Weah stayed near the door, silent and watchful. Jed noticed a few patrons whispering, their hands lingering near holstered guns. It didn't take long for trouble to find them. A burly man with a scarred face approached, voice dripping with venom. "You bringing her here to start a war, cowboy?" Jed's hand hovered near his holster. "She's just a girl trying to survive." The man sneered. "She's Comanche. That means death or worse." Before Jed could respond, the man lunged, swinging a fist. Jed caught it, twisting the man's arm behind his back. The saloon erupted into chaos, chairs scraping, glasses shattering, shouts filling the air. Gunfire followed. Jed ducked behind the bar, returning fire with cold precision. Weah slipped to the back, disappearing into the shadows. When the smoke cleared, 2 men lay groaning on the floor, and the rest scattered. Jed stood alone, heart pounding, blood pounding in his ears. A familiar voice cut through the din. Jed, he turned to see an old friend, Mac, stepping forward, face etched with concern. Dale's close. He's looking for you and her. Jed nodded grimly. We gotta move, fast. That night, Jed found Weah at the edge of town, tending to a wound on her arm. The girl looked up, eyes fierce despite the pain. We can't stay, Jed said. Dale's coming. Weah met his gaze, steady as the desert sky. Then we leave together. Jed felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in years, hope. But hope was a fragile thing in the West, and the road ahead was soaked in blood and gunpowder. The canyon walls loomed tall and jagged, casting long shadows as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Jed and Weah moved cautiously through the narrow pass, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on them like the heavy heat of the day. Jed's body ached from old wounds and fresh ones, but his mind was sharper than ever. The chase had led them here, the place where past sins and present choices would collide. Behind them, the distant sound of hooves thudded steadily closer. Lieutenant Dale and his men were relentless, their hunger for vengeance as fierce as the desert sun. Jed exchanged a glance with Weah, her dark eyes steady and determined. No words were needed. They prepared themselves for what was coming. The first shots shattered the stillness, echoes bouncing off the rock like thunder. Gunfire erupted, cutting through the air with deadly precision. Jed and Weah moved as one, covering each other, ducking behind boulders, weaving through the rugged terrain with practiced skill. Weah's knowledge of the land proved invaluable. She led Jed through hidden paths and rocky outcroppings, turning the canyon's natural maze into their ally. Dale's men struggled to keep up, their frustration mounting with each failed attempt. The fight was brutal, but measured, men and bullets trading blows in a deadly dance. Jed's heart pounded, every sense alive to the moment. He was no stranger to violence, but this was different. This was a reckoning, not just with his pursuers, but with himself. As the sun dipped lower, Jed faced Dale at last. The lieutenant's face was hard and unforgiving, eyes burning with hatred and obsession. They circled, the tension between them crackling like gunpowder. Jed held his ground, voice low and steady. This ends here. Dale sneered, reaching for his weapon, but Jed was faster. The final moments, blurred gunshots rang out, dust kicked up, and then silence. When the smoke cleared, Jed stood alone, breathing heavy, wounded but alive. Weah came to his side, her presence steady and unyielding. They had survived the reckoning, but the cost was written deep in the lines of their faces and the scars that would never fade. The dawn broke soft over the canyon, painting the sky with pale pinks and golds. Jed lay against a weathered rock, his breath shallow but steady. Weah sat close, tending to the wounds that time and violence had carved deep into both their bodies and souls. The fight was over. The dust had settled, but the silence that followed was heavy or quiet that spoke louder than any gunshot. Jed's thoughts drifted back to everything that had led him here, the battles, the bloodshed, the choices that haunted his every waking moment, and most of all, to the girl who had begged him once, "Please, don't take off my clothes." A plea that had shattered something inside him, and set them both on a path neither could have foreseen. Weah's eyes met his, calm and fierce in the early light. No words were needed. They shared an understanding forged in hardship and loss, in moments of terror and tenderness. "We've come a long way," she said softly. Jed nodded. "And it ain't over. Not yet." The frontier was vast and unforgiving, a land where justice was as unpredictable as the shifting winds. But somewhere in that endless horizon was hope, a chance for redemption, for healing. Together, they rose, the weight of the past still heavy but no longer crushing. They had survived the darkness, carried their scars like badges of survival, and faced a future uncertain but theirs to claim. As they rode away from the canyon, the sun rising behind them, Jed felt the first flicker of peace in a long time. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of acceptance. The land stretched out before them, wild and free, a new beginning waiting in the endless open sky. And for the first time in years, Jed dared to believe they could find it.